The audience had been laughing just seconds earlier, but that laughter stopped the moment Tom Cruise leaned forward and quietly said something that made the entire studio go still. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. But the way he said it completely changed the atmosphere of the interview, and even Whoopi Goldberg seemed surprised by the sudden shift in tone. Quick heads up, subscribe to Backstory Uncovered, because what starts as a normal conversation here is about to take a turn no one expected. The segment had begun with the usual daytime show energy. Tom Cruise walked out to loud applause, smiling and waving as he took his seat across from Whoopi Goldberg. The audience clearly loved him, and Whoopi greeted him with a warm grin. "Well, look who finally came to see us," Whoopi said, spreading her hands. "Tom Cruise in the house." The crowd erupted again. Tom laughed and nodded toward the audience. "It's good to be here." "You say that like you've been avoiding us," Whoopi joked. Tom smiled. No. I just move around a lot." The audience chuckled. Whoopi glanced at her notes. "You're here talking about the new film, which is already getting massive buzz. But honestly, Tom, people expect that from you." Tom shrugged modestly. "We just try to make the best movie we can." "We try," Whoopi repeated with a grin. "Like you haven't been doing this longer than some people in this audience have been alive." The crowd laughed loudly. Tom leaned back slightly in his chair. "That just means I've been lucky enough to keep working." Whoopi tilted her head. "Lucky?" Tom nodded. "Yeah. I love what I do." The conversation still felt relaxed. Whoopi crossed one leg over the other and leaned forward slightly. "But let's talk about something people always bring up with you," she said. "Your dedication." Tom smiled. "Okay. Because when people hear the stories about your movies," Whoopi continued, "they hear about the stunts, the training, the crazy schedules, and they start wondering if you're human." The audience laughed again. Tom chuckled. "I promise I'm human." "But you do your own stunts," Whoopi pressed. "Most of them," Tom admitted. The audience applauded. Whoopi shook her head. "See, that's the part one don't understand. At this point in your career, why keep taking those risks?" Tom leaned forward slightly. "Because the audience deserves the best experience possible," he replied. A few audience members clapped. Whoopi raised an eyebrow. "Or because Tom Cruise just likes pushing the limits?" Tom laughed softly. "Maybe a little of both." The crowd chuckled. Whoopi glanced toward the audience before asking her next question. "But here's something people also talk about," she said carefully. "You've always been very intense about your work." Tom nodded. "That's fair. Some people admire that," Whoopi continued. "Others say it can come across as a little controlling." The audience murmured. Tom's smile faded just a little. "What do you mean by controlling?" he asked calmly. Whoopi lifted her hands slightly. "Well, when stories come out about you overseeing every detail on set, every stunt, every camera angle, some people say it's more than just dedication." Tom paused. Then he nodded slowly. "I'm involved," he said. Whoopi tilted her head. "Very involved." The audience chuckled nervously. Tom leaned back again. "I care about the movies," he explained. "Of course," Whoopi said quickly. "But there are directors, producers, entire teams doing those jobs." Tom nodded again. "Yes." "But you still step in," Whoopi added. The room grew quieter. Tom's expression stayed calm. "When you've been doing this for 40 years, he said, "you learn a lot about filmmaking." A few people clapped. Whoopi nodded. "That's true," she said. But then she added something that made the tension rise again. "But sometimes that level of control can make other people uncomfortable." The audience murmured again. Tom looked at her carefully. "Who exactly feels uncomfortable?" he asked. Whoopi hesitated for a moment. "Well, people talk." Tom smiled slightly. "People always talk." The audience laughed. Whoopi leaned forward. "But sometimes those conversations raise real questions." Tom nodded slowly. "Like what?" Whoopi paused, choosing her words. "Like whether that level of intensity leaves room for collaboration." The room went quiet again. Tom sat still for a second before answering. Filmmaking is collaboration, he said. Whoopi crossed her arms lightly. Some would argue it becomes collaboration, as long as everyone agrees with Tom Cruise. The audience reacted with a mix of laughter and surprised murmurs. Tom looked down briefly, then back up. You think that's how I run a set? He asked. Whoopi shrugged. I'm asking. Tom leaned forward slightly now. I work with incredibly talented people, he said. Directors, writers, crews. We build these movies together. The audience clapped lightly. Whoopi nodded, but she didn't let the moment settle. But you're still the center of that machine. Tom paused again. Well, I'm the one hanging off the side of airplanes, he said. The audience burst into laughter. Whoopi laughed too. Fair point. For a moment the tension seemed to break. But then someone in the audience shouted loudly, "Do another stunt!" More laughter followed. Tom smiled politely, but then several people in the crowd started talking over each other, shouting suggestions for stunts. Jump off the building again. Climb another plane. The studio grew louder. Whoopi turned toward the audience, smiling. All right, settle down. But the crowd kept cheering and shouting. Tom watched them for a moment. Then he slowly leaned toward the microphone. And in a calm but firm voice, he said something that immediately silenced the entire room. Hey, let's give everyone a second here. The audience froze. It wasn't loud. It wasn't angry. But the sudden seriousness in his tone made the studio go completely quiet. Whoopi looked at him, slightly surprised. Tom glanced around the room before speaking again. I love the enthusiasm, he said, but there are a lot of people working to make this show happen right now. The audience went completely silent. Then a few people began clapping. Whoopi raised her eyebrows slightly, clearly not expecting Tom to take control of the moment like that. Well, she said slowly, I guess that answers the question about who's in charge. The audience laughed again. Tom smiled politely. But the tension between them hadn't disappeared. In fact, the real conversation was only just beginning. For a moment after Tom Cruise spoke, the studio stayed unusually quiet. The audience, which had just been cheering and shouting seconds earlier, now sat still, almost waiting to see what would happen next. Even Whoopi Goldberg paused before saying anything. Then she leaned back in her chair and gave a slow smile. Well, she said, glancing at the crowd, I guess when Tom Cruise says settle down, people listen. The audience laughed nervously, a few clapping. Tom smiled politely but didn't laugh as much as he had earlier. Hey, he said calmly, I appreciate the energy. I really do. Whoopi nodded. But you weren't enjoying the chaos? She asked. Tom shook his head slightly. I just respect the people working behind the scenes, he replied. There's a lot happening in a live studio. The audience clapped again. Whoopi raised an eyebrow. Look at that, she said. You've got the audience on your side now. Tom chuckled softly. I'm not trying to take sides. Whoopi leaned forward again, clearly interested in the moment that had just happened. But that was a pretty firm tone, she said. You kind of shut the room down. A few audience members murmured. Tom paused before answering. Well, he said, sometimes things get loud and someone has to reset the room. Whoopi tilted her head. Is that something you do often? Reset the room. Tom gave a small smile. Only when necessary. The audience laughed again. But Whoopi wasn't done with that thread. See, that's interesting, she said. Because earlier we were talking about how involved you are in your films. And now we've just watched you take control of a live audience. Tom nodded slowly. I didn't see it that way. Really? Whoopi asked. Tom shook his head. I just saw people excited, he said. And a show trying to continue. The audience clapped lightly again. Whoopi tapped the table thoughtfully. But it also shows something about you, she continued. You like things structured. Tom thought about that for a moment. I like things working. The audience chuckled. Whoopi smiled. Same thing, depending on who you ask. Tom leaned back in his chair again, visibly relaxed but clearly careful with his words. You know, he said, when you've been making films as long as I have, You learn that chaos can destroy good work pretty quickly. Whoopi nodded slowly. That sounds like a man who's had a few stressful movie sets. Tom laughed. More than a few. The audience laughed along with him. For a moment, the conversation felt lighter again. But then Whoopi asked the question that shifted the energy back toward tension. "Let me ask you something honestly," she said. Tom nodded. "Go ahead. Do you ever feel like your intensity intimidates people?" The room went quiet again. Tom blinked slowly. "Intimidates?" Whoopi shrugged slightly. "There are stories. People say you're incredibly focused, incredibly driven, and sometimes that can make people nervous." Tom took a breath before responding. "I expect people to take the work seriously," he said. "Which sounds reasonable," Whoopi replied. "But..." Whoopi smiled faintly. "But sometimes serious people don't realize how serious they seem." The audience chuckled. Tom smiled politely. "I've heard that before." Whoopi leaned forward again. "So do you try to change that?" Tom thought for a moment. "I try to be respectful," he said. "Always." Tom laughed quietly. "I'm human." The audience laughed with him. But Whoopi pressed just a little further. "Still," she said, "today you managed to quiet an entire audience with one sentence." Tom shrugged. "They were excited." Whoopi nodded. "And yet you didn't raise your voice. You didn't argue. You just said something, and the room stopped." The audience murmured. Tom paused before answering. "Well," he said slowly, "sometimes people respond to calm more than noise." A wave of applause moved through the crowd. Whoopi nodded slowly. "That's actually a pretty powerful lesson." Tom smiled slightly. "It works on movie sets too." The audience laughed again. Whoopi shook her head with a grin. "I'm starting to understand why directors trust you with billion-dollar productions." Tom laughed. "That's their decision." Whoopi pointed toward him playfully. "But you definitely like being involved." Tom smiled. "I like making great movies." The audience applauded again. Whoopi leaned back and looked toward the crowd. "Well, folks," she said, "I think we've learned something today." "What's that?" Tom asked. Whoopi smiled. "That Tom Cruise can quiet an entire room without even raising his voice." The audience burst into applause and laughter. Tom raised his hands modestly. "I promise I wasn't trying to silence anyone." Whoopi laughed. "You kind of did." The audience laughed again. As the applause continued, Whoopi turned back to Tom one last time. "Well, regardless of the debate," she said, "it's always interesting talking with you." Tom nodded. "I appreciate the conversation." The audience clapped again as the moment settled. And while the tension had eased, it was clear that the exchange, especially the moment Tom calmly shut down the noisy crowd, was the kind of live television moment people would be replaying and debating long after the show ended. So what do you think? Did Tom Cruise handle the situation perfectly, or did the moment show just how intense he can be when things get out of control? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to Backstory Uncovered for more unexpected talk show moments like this.